I arrived at my granddaughter's 21st birthday party at an upscale restaurant. The moment I reached the door, my stepson and daughter-in-law snapped, "Get her out of here. Her name isn't on the guest list." The entire room turned to stare. My granddaughter stood beside the cake, her lips trembling, but she didn't dare speak. Even worse, they tried to force me to sign papers transferring a $1.8 million house. They thought I was still a lonely old woman they could pressure. But that night, my late husband's lawyer was already in the room, holding the final letter my husband left behind. "I'm so grateful you found this. Truly. Now tell me something, where are you watching from right now? City, country, corner of the world, leave it in the comments. You'd be surprised how much it means to see you there. Fair warning, some elements of this story are fictional shaped for narrative and educational value. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story has to say, that part is worth your time. The chandeliers at Whitfield Manor have always made the same sound when the heating kicks on a faint, almost musical hum, like the building itself is clearing its throat. I noticed it the moment I walked through the front doors on the evening of April 6, 2024, because I was the one who had chosen those chandeliers, hand-blown glass from a workshop in Virginia Beach. I had driven 3 hours to pick them up myself back in 2009, because Arthur said I had better taste than any decorator he'd ever hired. That was the thing about Whitfield Manor. Every corner of it held a piece of me. The warm, amber light spilling over the tables I'd spent 2 weeks testing different bulb temperatures before settling on that exact shade. The ivory drapes framing the tall windows, I'd ordered them from a fabric house in Charleston and sewn the trim myself the winter I had too much time and too much grief. The white lilies lining the entry hall, their sweetness threading through the evening air. I planted the first bulbs in the side garden in 2011, the spring after we lost our closest neighbors, and the house felt too quiet. I knew every inch of this place. And standing just inside the doorway on that April evening watching the party Serena Pruitt had spent 5 months planning unfold across my floors, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not bitterness, something closer to clarity. I moved toward the windows on the far side of the room, the ones that overlooked the back garden. The jazz quartet in the corner was playing something slow and honeyed, the kind of music designed to make people feel elegant. Silver trays caught the light as the waitstaff moved through the crowd. On paper, it was a beautiful party. But I had been reading rooms for 65 years, and this room was telling me something. The guests weren't Savannah's people. I knew Savannah's people, the college friends who came for Sunday dinners, the girls she'd grown up with, the young man from her economics class she'd mentioned twice too many times to be casual. None of them were here. Instead, I saw men in expensive suits standing in tight clusters, the kind of clusters where business cards change hands, and eye contact is very deliberate. I recognized the posture of people attending a networking event, not a birthday celebration. I had just reached the window when I heard her voice. "Someone find the manager of this place," Serena said loudly enough that I could count on 2 people near her turning their heads, "and have that woman removed. She wasn't on the guest list." I did not turn around. I looked down at the glass of sparkling water in my hand. The bubbles were rising in slow, steady lines. I counted to 3. Then I smiled not at anyone in particular, just at the window at the dark garden beyond it, at the version of this moment I had imagined so many times over the past 5 years. The smile surprised even me. I had expected to feel the old familiar sting, that particular pain that lives just below the sternum and flares up every time someone speaks about you, like your furniture they'd like rearranged. But what I felt instead was almost warm. Behind me, I heard Serena's heels on the hardwood, sharp, impatient clicks moving away toward the event coordinator's table. I heard her say, her voice dropping, but not enough, "I don't know who let her in, but this is a private event, and I approved every name on that list personally." My jaw tightened just slightly. Not because she was wrong about the list. She was right, she hadn't included me, and I had come anyway, because Savannah had called me herself 3 weeks ago. Her voice careful in a way that meant she was somewhere she couldn't speak freely. "Grandma Ellie." she'd said, almost whispering. "Please come, please." My jaw tightened because of the word personally, the pride in it, the ownership. From across the room, I caught a glimpse of Savannah. She was standing near the birthday cake, a beautiful 3-tiered thing, decorated with fresh flowers, and she was laughing at something her friend Zoe had said, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes. I knew that laugh. It was the one she used when she was performing happiness for an audience. Her eyes found mine across the room. For just a second, something moved across her face, relief or maybe just recognition. She gave me the smallest nod, and I felt my heart clench with a tenderness so sharp it almost hurt. That child had her grandfather's eyes, and right now those eyes were asking me to stay. I turned back to the window. Somewhere behind me, Brenda, my event manager, 15 years and counting, was moving through the room with the particular efficiency of a woman who knew every possible way the evening could unfold. I wasn't worried about Brenda. Brenda knew exactly who she worked for. I took a slow sip of sparkling water and let myself look at the garden Arthur had planted the roses just beginning to bud in the April cool. To understand why I smiled instead of flinching, you need to know what kind of woman I was before that night, and what kind of woman this family spent 5 years trying to make me forget I was. They had spent 5 years trying to make me small. What they didn't know was that I had spent those same 5 years getting ready for exactly this moment. But to tell you about that April night, I have to go back, not to the beginning of my story, but to the beginning of theirs. The year was 2001. I was 42 years old, recently divorced, and thoroughly convinced I had no business attending a charity auction in downtown Charlottesville, wearing heels that were slightly too high for the uneven cobblestone outside. I almost didn't go. My friend Patricia had called me 3 times that week until I finally ran out of excuses. Arthur Voss was standing near the back of the room when I first saw him. He wasn't the most polished man there. His jacket was good, but slightly too broad in the shoulders, like he'd bought it years ago and never bothered replacing it. He was bidding on a watercolor landscape of the Blue Ridge Mountains, with the focused expression of a man who had decided he was going to win and had stopped caring what it cost. He won. Then he turned around and caught me watching, and instead of being embarrassed, he just grinned. "You were judging my jacket," he said, walking straight over like we'd already been introduced. I felt warmth rise in my cheeks. "I was judging your bidding strategy," I said. "You drove that price up 40% in the last 2 minutes." He laughed a full, unself-conscious laugh that made the people nearest to us turn and look. "Worth every penny," he said, and held out his hand. "Arthur Voss." That was Arthur. Not smooth, not calculated, just completely disarmingly himself. We were married in 2003, and in 2004 we bought an old farmhouse property on the western edge of Albemarle County, 11 acres, a main house in serious need of attention, and a carriage house that Arthur immediately declared would become an event venue. I thought he was out of his mind. I helped him anyway. We spent 2 years rebuilding that property with our own hands and the help of a small crew Arthur trusted. He chose the stonework. I chose the windows. He planted the rose garden in the back. I designed the layout of the main hall. By the time we opened Whitfield Manor for its first event in 2006, a retirement party for a retired judge, we had built something that felt genuinely ours. Every room of it carried both of our fingerprints. What it did not carry was Conrad's blessing. Arthur's son from his first marriage was 18 years old when Arthur and I started dating. I had prepared myself in that careful way women prepare for things they know will be hard, for some awkwardness, some adjustment period. What I had not prepared for was the particular quality of Conrad's dislike, precise, deliberate, and dressed up just enough in politeness to make it difficult to name outright. The first time Arthur brought me to dinner at his house, Conrad shook my hand exactly once. One firm shake, palm-dry grip, controlled. Then he looked at his father and said, "How long is this one staying?" Arthur laughed like it was a joke. I smiled like it didn't cut. But it cut. Of course it cut. I was a grown woman sitting at a dinner table being measured for how long before I'd be gone, and the man I loved laughed because the alternative, addressing it directly, would have required a harder conversation than Arthur was prepared to have that night. That was Arthur's great flaw, and I loved him anyway. He was a man who could build anything with his hands and fix almost anything with patience. But confronting his son was a door he kept finding reasons not to open. Over the years, Arthur gave Conrad chances in the family business, real chances, meaningful ones, a role managing vendor contracts, a seat at the table during property negotiations, an opportunity to oversee a small renovation project that could have become something larger if it had gone well. In 2010, it didn't go well. I didn't know the full details at the time. What I knew was that Arthur came home one evening in October looking like a man who had just received news he'd been half expecting and still wasn't ready for. He sat down at the kitchen table, loosened his tie, and pressed his fingers against his eyes. "Arthur," I said, setting down the dish towel I was holding. "What happened?" He dropped his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, and my chest ached at the sight of it. This man who held everything so steadily cracking just slightly at the edges. "It's handled," he said. "Just a business matter. It's handled." "Conrad," I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, "It's handled, Ellie." That was the end of it. He never told me the details. He absorbed whatever had happened, quietly rearranged things behind the scenes, and kept moving forward. Conrad received what looked from the outside like a reduction in responsibilities, a reorganization Arthur called it, and life continued. What I understood watching Arthur that night and in the weeks that followed was that he still loved Conrad. Fiercely, painfully, in the way parents love children who keep disappointing them, not less but differently, more carefully. The way you love something fragile that you've already dropped once. He stopped trusting Conrad with certain things, but he never stopped hoping that would change. I think that hope cost him more than he ever admitted. Arthur never told Conrad the full truth about what had happened with the money. I found out years later, not from Arthur, but from a man named Carl Whitmore, who had been sitting across the table when it happened and had never quite forgiven himself for staying quiet. Arthur died on a Thursday morning in November 2019. The leaves outside our bedroom window were still orange. I remember thinking that was wrong, that the world should have looked different, that something in the sky or the air should have shifted to mark the fact that Arthur Voss was no longer in it. But the leaves stayed orange, the morning light kept coming through the curtains at the same angle it always had, and the world went right on being itself without asking my permission. He had been sick for 14 months. We had known in that careful way you know things you are not yet ready to say out loud that the time was narrowing. Still, when it actually happened, when the breathing changed and then stopped, I sat beside him for a long time before I called anyone. I held his hand and I talked to him because I had read somewhere that hearing is the last sense to go, and I refused to believe it wasn't true. I told him about the roses in the back garden. I told him the carriage house roof had finally stopped leaking. I told him Savannah had called the week before asking about Thanksgiving and that her voice sounded like his when she laughed. I told him I would keep my promise. He had asked me 3 weeks before the end to wait. Wait for Savannah Ellie. He'd said, his voice thin but his eyes still sharp. Just wait until she's ready. You'll know when. I had nodded. I hadn't fully understood yet what I was waiting for, but Arthur had a way of asking for things that made you trust the asking even before you understood the reason. The funeral was held the following Tuesday at a small Episcopal church in Charlottesville that Arthur had attended since childhood. It was a full service, the kind that runs long because too many people want to speak. I sat in the front row and listened to men describe Arthur Voss in terms that were accurate but incomplete, the way eulogies often are. They talked about his business acumen, his generosity, his handshake, which apparently several people found memorable. Conrad and Serena sat 2 rows behind me. I noticed I couldn't help noticing that Conrad checked his watch 3 times during the service. The 3rd time, Serena put her hand on his arm. He stopped. But the checking had already happened, and I had already seen it, and I had already filed it away in that quiet part of my mind where I kept the things I wasn't ready to deal with yet. 3 weeks later, I sat in the office of Edmund Farley, Arthur's attorney of 22 years, a steady, careful man in his mid-60s, who had the particular quality of making difficult rooms feel manageable, and listened to the terms of Arthur's will. Edmund read clearly and without editorializing the way good lawyers do. The Voss house, the primary family residence on Maple Creek Road, along with the majority of Arthur's liquid assets and his remaining interest in Whitfield Manor's operating accounts, was left to Eleanor Voss. Conrad Pruitt would receive a cash settlement and a percentage of the holding company's shares, a meaningful amount, not a token. Conrad let Edmund finish the sentence. Then he stood up. "He built that house for our family," Conrad said. His voice was controlled, but his knuckles, where he gripped the back of his chair, had gone white. "That woman has no right to it. She's been his wife for 16 years, not his whole life. That house existed before she walked in." Edmund looked at him over the rim of his glasses, unhurried. "Mr. Pruitt," he said very quietly, "your father anticipated this reaction. He left a letter." Conrad's jaw tightened. "I don't want a letter." "Conrad," Serena started, "I said I don't want a letter." His voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough that I heard the grief underneath the anger raw and real, and despite everything, my chest ached for him. He had 16 years to talk to me. He didn't need to hide behind a piece of paper. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraped hard against the wood floor, and walked out. The door didn't slam exactly, but it closed with a force that made the framed diplomas on Edmund's wall shudder. Serena looked at me. Her expression was unreadable. Then she gathered her bag and followed her husband without a word. Edmund and I sat in the quiet they left behind. He set the letter on the desk in front of me, a plain white envelope, Arthur's handwriting on the front. Just my name. Ellie. My hands were trembling as I picked it up. I pressed them flat against the envelope for a moment, willing them steady. Edmund rose without being asked and stepped out, closing the door softly behind him, giving me the privacy I hadn't thought to ask for. I opened the letter. Arthur's handwriting was uneven in places the way it had been in those last months when holding a pen took effort, but the words were clear. He wrote, "I'm not giving her the house because I don't love you, Conrad. I'm giving her the house because I love Savannah more than I love your anger. Eleanor will know what to do. She always has. Trust her the way I trusted her, which is to say completely and without conditions." I read it twice, then a third time. It was the third time that I finally understood what Arthur had actually been building all those years. Not just Whitfield Manor, not just a business, not just a life with me. He had been building a shelter for Savannah, the kind of shelter a grandfather builds when he knows in the quiet, honest place where fathers keep their truest assessments of their children that his son might one day become a danger to his granddaughter's future. He had trusted me to be that shelter. My eyes burned and my throat went tight, and I pressed Arthur's letter against my chest and breathed through it, one breath, then another, until the shaking in my hands settled into something steadier. I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket. I did not cry. Not then. Because I knew that letter was only the beginning. And when I stood and walked to the window, I could see Conrad already outside on the sidewalk, below phone pressed to his ear, his posture tight with purpose, talking to someone I didn't recognize yet, someone who would become a very important problem later. After that Thursday in November, the calls started almost immediately. Not to me, to Arthur's old friends, to neighbors, to anyone Conrad thought might listen to his version of the story. I know because they told me. One by one, over the weeks that followed, people who had known Arthur for decades called to offer condolences and gently, carefully mentioned that Conrad had reached out, that he was telling people the will had been manipulated, that I had influenced Arthur in his final months when he wasn't thinking clearly, that the house should have gone to blood family. The first time I heard it repeated back to me, I was sitting at the kitchen table in the Voss house with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands, and I felt something move through my chest that was equal parts grief and fury, a combination so tangled I couldn't separate one from the other. My eyes burned hot and my throat closed up, and I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and breathed through it because I refused to fall apart over a lie, told by a man who hadn't bothered to stay and read his own father's letter. I gave myself 5 minutes. Then I washed my face, refilled my coffee, and got on with the day. That was the pattern of those years. Feel it. Breathe through it. Get on with the day. Conrad's campaign was persistent, if not particularly sophisticated. He called me the woman who stole my father's house to anyone who would listen at family gatherings at the club he and Serena belonged to in Charlottesville, in quiet conversations at the edges of mutual friends' dinner parties. He never said it to my face directly. Conrad was too careful for that. He preferred the version of cruelty that gave him deniability. And then there was Gavin. Gavin Pruitt was Conrad's first cousin, 34 years old, chronically between jobs, and the kind of man who attached himself to whoever was currently holding the most power in any given room. He had floated in and out of the family's orbit for years, borrowing money with the casual confidence of someone who had never once been told no, firmly enough to believe it. When Arthur was alive, Gavin had been charming if unreliable. After Arthur died and Conrad became the loudest voice in the family, Gavin became something else entirely. He started calling me the house guest who never left. The first time he said it was at a 4th of July cookout at Conrad and Serena's place in the summer of 2020. He said it loudly to a group of people standing near the back porch with the particular enjoyment of someone who has found a joke that lands and intends to use it until it stops working. I was standing close enough to hear every word. I felt heat rush up the back of my neck so fast it made my ears ring. My hands curled into fists at my sides, not because I wanted to do anything with them, but because my body needed somewhere to put the anger that my face was not going to show. I uncurled them deliberately, one finger at a time, and walked over to the lemonade table and poured myself a glass with perfectly steady hands. Small victories. The worst moment of those 5 years didn't come from Conrad or Gavin. It came from a Tuesday afternoon in September of 2021. Serena had invited me to a family gathering at their house, a casual thing, she said, just a few relatives passing through. I suspected the invitation was less about warmth and more about appearances. Edmund Farley had advised both sides during the ongoing discussions about the estate to maintain civil family contact. Serena was nothing if not strategic about optics. I went. I wore a blue dress I liked and told myself the afternoon would be fine. It was fine mostly until I slipped away to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The kitchen door was partially open. I could hear Serena's voice on the other side pitched low, but not low enough the particular volume of a woman who believes she's out of earshot. She has nowhere else to go, Serena was saying. That's the only reason she's still holding on. She knows if she lets go of that house, she has nothing. No family, no money of her own, nothing. She's 62 years old and completely dependent on what Arthur left her. Someone murmured in response. I didn't catch the words. Serena laughed. It was a light, dismissive sound. Conrad will outlast her. He just has to be patient. I stood on my side of that door and felt something happen in my chest that I can only describe as a slow, deliberate breaking. Not the sharp crack of sudden pain, but the kind that works its way through you quietly, like a fracture spreading through stone. My eyes filled, and I blinked hard, once, twice, pressing my fingernails into my palm to give the feeling somewhere smaller to live. She thought I was holding on out of desperation. She thought I was afraid. She had no idea what I was actually doing. I set my empty glass down on the counter, without getting my water, walked back through the hallway, said goodbye to 2 relatives whose names I could never remember, and drove home. In the car, I let myself cry finally fully the way I hadn't allowed since Arthur's funeral. I cried for the woman Serena thought I was. I cried for the 5 years of dinners and gatherings and careful smiles. I cried because it was exhausting, holding this much quiet inside you for this long, and sometimes the weight of it pressed down so hard that breathing felt like an act of stubbornness. But here is what Serena didn't know, what none of them knew. 8 months before Arthur died, when he was still well enough to sit at his desk, but tired enough to need help with the paperwork, he had come to me with something that made my blood run cold. Conrad had years earlier persuaded Arthur to sign a joint financing agreement tied to the Voss house, buried inside a stack of business documents Arthur had trusted Conrad to explain accurately. Conrad had told him it was a standard refinancing instrument. It was not. It was a mechanism that allowed a company holding partially in Conrad's name to borrow against the property. By the summer of 2019, that borrowing had ballooned into a debt the company couldn't service, and the bank had begun default proceedings. If nothing was done, the bank would move to force a sale. I called Edmund Farley the same afternoon Arthur showed me the documents. Edmund confirmed the situation in terms that made the room feel smaller. I had 3 weeks. I liquidated the investment account I had built over 20 years of careful saving, every careful dollar I had set aside since my first marriage ended, and I had decided that I would never again be financially dependent on anyone, and I wired what it took to clear the debt. Every dollar of it. I did not tell Arthur the amount. He was dying. He did not need to carry that number alongside everything else. I did not tell Arthur the full amount. He was dying. He did not need to carry that. I did not tell Conrad. He did not deserve to know. I told no one except Edmund, who recorded it properly and filed it away in a folder I knew I would need someday. 5 years is a long time to stay quiet. But Arthur had asked me for one thing before he closed his eyes for the last time. He had reached for my hand, and his grip was weaker than it used to be. And he said, "Wait for Savannah Ellie, just wait." So I waited. Through every cookout and cruel nickname and kitchen conversation I was never supposed to hear. And in March of 2024, the waiting was finally over. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in February cream-colored heavy paper, the kind Serena always ordered from that stationery shop in Georgetown. She liked to mention at least twice per conversation. I found it between a water bill and a seed catalog in the stack of mail by the front door. I knew what it was before I opened it. Serena's handwriting on the outer envelope had that particular controlled elegance. She practiced the kind that looked effortless and wasn't. I set the water bill aside. I set the seed catalog aside. I held the cream envelope for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and then I opened it at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee. The card inside was beautiful. I'll give Serena that she had genuine taste in paper goods, even when the paper goods were being used for something that had nothing to do with the person whose name was printed on them in gold script, Savannah Rose Pruitt. 21st birthday celebration, April 6, 2024. And then below the date and time the venue, Whitfield Manor, Albemarle County, Virginia. I read that line twice. Then I set the card down very carefully on the kitchen table, the way you set down something fragile, and I looked out the window at the February yard bare trees, frost still on the grass, the rose garden Arthur had planted nothing but brown canes waiting for spring. Whitfield Manor, my Whitfield Manor. Conrad and Serena had booked my event venue to host a party at which they intended to pressure me into surrendering my home. The irony was so complete, so perfectly constructed, that for a moment I almost admired it, before I realized they hadn't constructed it at all. They had simply booked the nicest venue in the county, without ever once thinking to look up who owned it. Serena had handled the logistics. That was always how they divided things. Conrad with the strategy and Serena with the arrangements, and she had found Whitfield Manor through a regional events directory that listed only the venue name and Brenda's booking contact. No ownership information, no reason in Serena's mind to look further. That was the thing about people who had spent years deciding you were unimportant. They stopped doing their research. My phone rang at 10:30. I recognized the number before I picked up. Mrs. Voss said, Brenda Scholl, my event manager at Whitfield Manor for the past 15 years, a woman whose organizational precision I trusted more than most people's sworn testimony. I wanted to call you personally. The Pruitt family made a booking yesterday for April 6th. Full venue rental, catered dinner for 60 guests, full event staff. A brief pause. I assumed you knew. Should I reach out to them with any notes from ownership? I leaned back in my chair. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post near the rose garden and sat there looking very sure of itself. "No, Brenda," I said. "Don't say a word." Another pause, shorter this time. Brenda had worked with me long enough to understand when a situation required questions and when it required trust. "Of course, Mrs. Voss," she said. "I'll handle it as a standard booking." "Thank you." I hesitated, then added, "Make sure the East Garden lighting is fully operational by the first week of April. The amber setting, not the white." Already on the schedule, Whitfield Manor had always operated under my name, directly, a sole proprietorship, the way Arthur and I had set it up in 2004 before holding companies and tax structures became the language our family spoke. Conrad had booked through Tessa Birch's event coordination service, which handled the paperwork on his behalf. He had never once looked at the contract himself, Brenda said, and I could hear the small, quiet smile in her voice. I sat with the invitation for the rest of that morning, turning the situation over in my mind, the way you turn a stone in your hand, examining each angle, each edge, each place where it might catch the light differently than you expected. The call from Savannah came 4 days later. It was a Thursday evening, and I was in the kitchen doing nothing in particular, a thing I had given myself permission to do more of since Arthur died, when my phone lit up with her name. I answered on the second ring. "Grandma Ellie." Her voice was bright in that particular way it got when she was performing brightness for an audience she hoped wasn't obvious. I had known that voice since she was 7 years old and trying to convince me she hadn't eaten the last of the blueberry muffins. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. I kept my voice warm and easy. "How are you?" "Good, good, busy, end of semester things." A small pause. "Mom said she sent you the invitation for my birthday party. Are you coming?" There it was, the careful phrasing. "Mom said she sent you the invitation, not did you get the invitation, not, I really want you there," Mom said. She was checking whether the information had been transmitted, not whether I felt wanted. My chest tightened with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger. It was closer to grief for this girl who had learned somewhere along the way to manage the gap between what her parents did and what she wished they would do. "I got the invitation," I said. "It's a beautiful card." "Yeah." A beat. "You're coming, right?" And here is the thing about Savannah that had always undone me. From the time she was small, she asked directly. Not with manipulation, not with performance, just with the straightforward need of a person who actually wanted the answer. She had never learned to protect herself from wanting things the way her father had. I thought about the first time she had shown up at my door at night, maybe 10 years old, wearing her pajamas and carrying a stuffed rabbit she was definitely too old for and definitely still needed. Her parents had been arguing loudly the way they did in those years before they learned to fight more quietly. She had slipped out the side door and walked the 3 blocks to my house in the dark. I had opened the door before she knocked. I had seen her coming down the sidewalk through the front window. "Are you hungry?" I asked. "Kind of," she said, and walked past me into the kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world because to her it was. I made pancakes at 10 o'clock at night, buttermilk with blueberries the way she liked, and she sat at my kitchen counter and ate 2 full plates and talked to me about her science project while the rabbit sat on the stool beside her. She fell asleep on the couch, watching a nature documentary, and I covered her with the quilt Arthur's mother had made, the one with the yellow squares, and she slept there until morning. That was our relationship, built in kitchens and quiet evenings and small, reliable acts of showing up. It had nothing to do with Serena's invitation list or Conrad's agenda or any piece of paper anyone had ever tried to make me sign. "Yes," I told her, "I'm coming." She exhaled a real one, the kind that meant she had been holding it. "Good," she said. "Good. I'm glad." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, the phone still warm in my hand. Then I found Edmund Farley's number in my contacts and dialed. He answered on the third ring. "Eleanor." "Edmund," I said. "I need you at Whitfield Manor on April 6th, by 7 o'clock. A pause. "As a guest." "No, I said, as the man who is about to finish what Arthur started." There was a longer pause this time, and then Edmund said in the measured tone of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular phone call, "I'll be there." I arrived at Whitfield Manor at 6:45 on the evening of April 6th, 15 minutes after the party started intentionally. I had dressed carefully, not to impress anyone, not to make a statement, just to feel like myself. A deep navy wrap dress I had owned for 3 years and loved unreservedly, the pearl earrings Arthur had given me for our 10th anniversary, low heels I could stand in for 4 hours without negotiating with my feet. When I looked in the mirror before leaving the house, I saw a 65-year-old woman who knew exactly where she was going and why. That was enough. The gravel drive curved up through the old oak trees the way it always had, the landscape lighting, catching the new spring leaves just right, a detail I had spent an embarrassing amount of time getting right back in 2012. I pulled in slowly, parked near the side entrance I knew the staff used, and sat in the car for exactly 1 minute. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to arrive with my feet under me. Then I got out, smoothed my dress, and walked in through the front doors of my own property. The first thing that hit me was the scent white lilies, exactly as I had specified when I planted the first bulbs along the entry corridor in 2009. They were in full bloom, ivory and sweet lining, both sides of the hall in the tall glass vases I had ordered from a glassblower in Staunton. Behind them, the amber light from the chandeliers fell over everything in that warm, honeyed way I had calibrated over 2 winters of trial and error with different bulb temperatures. From the far corner, a jazz quartet was playing something slow and unhurried. I had recommended that quartet to Brenda last year for exactly this kind of event. The music moved through the room like water, filling the edges without crowding the center. It was objectively a beautiful party, and it had almost nothing to do with Savannah. I moved along the perimeter of the room, letting the crowd absorb me before anyone official noticed I had arrived. I read the room the way I had learned to read rooms over 40 years of hosting events and navigating families that ran on subtext, not by looking at faces directly, but by watching where people's attention went when they thought no one was watching them. The guests were wrong. That was the only word for it. They were wrong for a 21st birthday. The room held maybe 60 people, and the clusters they had formed were the clusters of professional networking, not friendship. Men in well-cut suits exchanging business cards near the bar. Women in cocktail attire who greeted each other with the particular warmth of people who see each other at events rather than in kitchens. Conversations conducted at a volume designed to be overheard by the right people. I knew most of Conrad's professional circle by sight after 23 years in the same county, but 2 men I spotted near the east windows made my stomach tighten in a way I hadn't expected. The first was Sterling Mack, a real estate broker out of Richmond whose name had come up twice in conversations I had overhead at community board meetings, always in conjunction with high-value property transactions that moved fast and quiet. I recognized him from a photograph in a trade publication Edmund had flagged for me 6 months ago, with a short note attached, "Be aware of this one." Sterling Mack stood with the loose, confident posture of a man who had already done his homework and was simply waiting for the transaction to catch up with him. Beside him stood a shorter man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a phone he checked every 3 minutes with the focused anxiety of someone monitoring a situation in real time. That, I was reasonably certain, was Philip Dre Conrad's financial advisor, whose name appeared on several of the documents Edmund had reviewed in recent months. He had the look of a man who preferred spreadsheets to people and was currently tolerating people for professional reasons. A real estate broker and a financial advisor at your 21-year-old granddaughter's birthday party. The picture that assembled itself in my mind was not a comfortable one. I was still processing it when I heard her voice. "Grandma Ellie." I turned and there was Savannah cutting through the crowd toward me. with the particular determination of someone who has been watching the door. She was wearing a pale gold dress that suited her perfectly, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she was smiling the real smile, the one that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. The sight of it made my chest crack open with something so warm and so sharp at the same time that I had to breathe through it. She walked straight into my arms and hugged me hard, and I held on. She smelled like the same vanilla lotion she had used since she was 15, and for a moment everything else stopped mattering. The real estate broker, the financial advisor Conrad watching from across the room, all of it receded, and there was only this girl, this young woman pressing her face against my shoulder, the way she had as a child when something was too heavy to carry alone. "I'm so glad you came," she said against my shoulder, and her voice was thick in a way that told me she had been worried I wouldn't. "I told you I would," I said into her hair. My own voice was steadier than I felt. "I always do." She pulled back and looked at me, and I saw something behind her bright eyes, a flicker of something she wasn't saying, attention held carefully in check. Before I could ask, Zoe appeared at her elbow. Zoe Callahan was Savannah's closest friend, 22 years old, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the particular social acuity that comes from being the observant one in every room. She had never pretended to like Conrad and Serena, which I had always privately respected. "Mrs. Voss." Zoe hugged me briefly, then pulled back and lowered her voice, leaning slightly toward Savannah. "Okay, I'm sorry, but I have to say it again. This doesn't feel like your birthday party, Sav. It feels like your dad's networking event with a cake in it." Savannah's smile tightened at the corners. "It's fine, Zoe." "The guy by the window has handed out 4 business cards in the last 20 minutes, Zoe said. I counted. "Zoe, I'm just saying what everyone is thinking." Zoe glanced at me with an expression that said she suspected I was thinking it too, and appreciated the company. "The food is very good," Savannah said with the determined brightness of someone trying to find solid ground, and I felt my heart ache for her. This girl working so hard to be gracious about a party that was never really for her. "It is," I agreed warmly, squeezing her hand, "and you look absolutely beautiful." She squeezed back hard, grateful, like she was holding on to something. Over her shoulder, I saw Conrad across the room. He had gone very still the moment he registered me. His champagne glass paused halfway to his mouth. Then he turned to Serena beside him and said something low and quick. Serena's chin lifted slightly, that particular movement she made when shifting from social mode into operational mode, and she nodded once. I watched Serena excuse herself from the group of women she'd been standing with and walk toward the event coordinator's table where Tessa Birch stood with her clipboard and her professionally pleasant expression. I couldn't hear what Serena said, but I watched Tessa Birch nod, slowly glance in my direction, and pick up her clipboard with the focused energy of someone who has just been given a task. That was when I knew the evening was about to begin in earnest. I had been at the party for exactly 22 minutes when Conrad appeared at my elbow, not to welcome me, but to steer me. I felt him before I saw him. That particular shift in the air that happens when someone moves through a crowd with intention rather than sociability. One moment I was watching Savannah laugh at something Zoe said across the room, feeling the warmth of that sight spread through my chest like the first sip of something hot on a cold morning. The next moment, Conrad was beside me, his hand touching my elbow with the light, practiced pressure of a man who had learned to guide people without appearing to push them. "Eleanor." His voice was smooth as fresh paint over old wood, covering everything, revealing nothing. "I'm glad you came. You look well." My jaw tightened just slightly enough for me to feel it, not enough for him to see it. Conrad had not told me I looked well in 5 years. The compliment sat in the air between us like a counterfeit bill, the right shape, the wrong weight. "Thank you, Conrad," I said pleasantly. "It's a beautiful evening." "It is." He smiled, that careful, controlled smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Actually, there's something I've been meaning to discuss. A family matter. Would you mind stepping over here for a moment? It's a bit quieter." He gestured toward the alcove near the north windows, away from the main flow of the party. I looked at the alcove. I looked at Conrad. I felt something tighten in my stomach, a cold, clarifying tension, like the moment before weather changes. "Of course," I said, and let him lead me there. We had barely reached the alcove when Serena materialized. There was no other word for it. She simply appeared as though she had been waiting just out of sight, which she almost certainly had been. She was holding a cream-colored envelope thick with the weight of multiple pages, and she was wearing the expression she always wore when she wanted to appear generous while doing something that was anything but. Eleanor. Serena's voice was warm, practiced, calibrated to the exact temperature of friendly but businesslike. "I'm so glad we have a moment. Conrad and I have been thinking about the family situation, and we wanted to present something constructive." She held out the envelope. "It's just an internal family agreement, nothing complicated at all. It clarifies the management arrangement for the house, makes everything cleaner going forward." I looked at the envelope. I did not reach for it. "What kind of clarification?" I asked. A beat small but real, the kind of pause that happens when someone has prepared for most answers but not quite this one. Conrad stepped in smoothly. "It transfers day-to-day operational control to a family holding entity," he said. "Standard structure. A lot of families use it. It simplifies the tax picture considerably, protects the asset from probate complications down the line." He paused, then added with the particular confidence of a man playing what he believes is his strongest card, "Edmund can look it over if you'd like. We have nothing to hide." And there it was. Edmund. They had assumed Edmund Farley was a neutral party, an old family lawyer who might lend the arrangement an air of legitimacy. What they did not know, could not have known, was that Edmund was standing 40 feet away near the bar right now, had been for the past 20 minutes, and had come tonight specifically at my request. The irony of it bloomed in my chest like something almost painful in its perfection. I kept my face completely neutral. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "I'll take a look at it later in the evening." Serena's smile widened too quickly, too easily, the smile of someone who has just received the answer they expected. "Of course," she said. "No rush at all. We just wanted it on your radar." She pressed the envelope into my hand. Her fingers were cold. I noticed that. I took the envelope and held it at my side, and I watched Conrad's eyes flick just once, just briefly, across the room toward the east windows, toward Sterling Mack, who was still standing where I had noted him, earlier champagne in hand, watching the room with the patient alertness of a man waiting for a signal. Sterling Mack caught Conrad's glance. He gave the smallest possible nod, barely a movement at all, just a millimeter of his chin dropping and rising. A confirmation, a check-in. The cold thing in my stomach sharpened into something clearer. This had been coordinated. The envelope, the timing, the no rush, that meant exactly the opposite. Sterling Mack wasn't here for the champagne or the birthday cake. He was here because someone had told him tonight was the night the transaction moved forward. "Enjoy the party," I said to Conrad and Serena, and I turned and walked away before either of them could read anything in my expression that I wasn't ready to give them. I moved through the room at a steady, unhurried pace, past the waitstaff with their trays, past a cluster of Conrad's business associates, who didn't know who I was, past Savannah, who caught my eye from across the room with a questioning look, and got a small, reassuring nod in return. I would explain later. I would explain everything later. Edmund Farley was standing near the bar exactly where I expected him, holding a glass of water, watching the room with the quiet, unhurried attention of a man who had spent 40 years reading situations that other people were still trying to understand. He had the particular stillness of old lawyers at rest, not passive, never passive, just deeply patient. He saw me coming. He saw the envelope in my hand. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, but recognition. A piece clicking into place. I reached him and held out the envelope without a word. He set down his water glass and opened it with the methodical care of someone for whom document review is a reflex as natural as breathing. He read the first page, then the second. I watched his face, the small furrow between his brows, the way his jaw tightened, the almost imperceptible thinning of his lips that I had come to recognize over many years and many difficult conversations as Edmund Farley's version of alarm. He looked up at me. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his voice low and steady as river stone. "This is not a family agreement." We stepped outside onto the side terrace, the one overlooking the rose garden Arthur had planted in 2007. April in Virginia had not yet fully committed to warmth, and the evening air carried that particular cool dampness of early spring, the kind that smells like turned earth and new grass and things beginning again whether you're ready for them or not. The noise of the party dropped away behind the glass doors. Out here, the only sounds were the faint hum of the string lights I had installed along the garden fence in 2014 and the first crickets of the season starting up in the dark beyond the roses. Edmund stood under the terrace light and read. He turned each page slowly with the deliberate care of a man who had learned decades ago never to skim anything that mattered. I stood beside him with my arms crossed over my chest, not because I was cold, but because I needed somewhere to put my hands that wasn't shaking. I watched his face. Edmund Farley had the kind of face that legal training had made into a professional instrument, controlled, measured, giving away only what he chose to give. But I had known this man for over 20 years, and I could read the things he didn't intend to show. The slight deepening of the line between his brows, the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, like he was biting down on something he hadn't decided yet whether to swallow. He finished the last page. Then he lowered the documents and looked at me with the expression of a man who wishes he had different news. "All right," he said. "Let me be precise because you deserve precise." He held up the first page. "This is not a management clarification. This is a control transfer agreement. If you sign this, Eleanor, you are assigning operational authority over the Voss House to a limited liability company, Pruitt Family Holdings, LLC, incorporated in Virginia 8 months ago." He paused to let that land. 8 months ago. They have been planning this since last August. The air went out of me in a slow, quiet rush. 8 months. While I had been tending the garden and managing Whitfield Manor and waiting patiently for April, Conrad had been filing corporate paperwork. "What does operational authority mean in practice?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "It means," Edmund said, "that while your name remains on the deed, you lose the unilateral right to make decisions about the property. You cannot sell it without the LLC's approval. You cannot refinance it. You cannot transfer it to anyone." He let that word hang in the cool air between us. "Including Savannah." My throat tightened so sharply it almost hurt. I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose. "There is a clause on page 4. Edmund continued, his voice remaining level, because one of us needed to remain level, and he had appointed himself that person. "If you sign this and Pruitt Family Holdings declares insolvency, which given what I have been able to determine about Conrad's current financial position is not a remote possibility, the house does not revert to you. It goes to the company's creditors." I heard those words. I understood those words. And then my legs made a quiet decision without consulting me, and I sat down on the stone step at the edge of the terrace. Not because the world was spinning, not because I couldn't stand, but because my body needed one moment, just one, to absorb the full weight of what I was holding. They had not just planned to pressure me into signing. They had built a mechanism by which if I signed and things went wrong, and things with Conrad's finances had a long, documented history of going wrong, the Voss house could end up in the hands of strangers. Creditors who had never set foot in the kitchen where Arthur taught himself to make biscuits, who had never seen the light come through the east windows on a winter morning, who had no idea that the crack in the back hallway baseboard was from the winter of 2011 when the pipes froze, and Arthur and I had laughed about it for years afterward. Arthur's voice came back to me then low and certain the way it always was when he was telling me something he had thought through carefully. We'd been sitting on this same terrace the summer before he got sick, watching the roses bloom. He had been quiet for a while, and then he said, "Conrad doesn't want the house, Ellie. He wants what he can get for it." I had pushed back. I remembered it clearly, the discomfort of it, the way I had wanted so badly for him to be wrong. He grew up in that house, Arthur. Whatever else he is, it means something to him. Arthur had looked at me with those tired, clear eyes. "The house means money to him, Ellie. It has for a long time. I just didn't want to see it until I couldn't look away anymore." I had not believed him fully. Not then. I had filed it in that place where we keep the things we hope will turn out not to be true. Sitting on that stone step with Edmund's careful summary still hanging in the April air, I believed him completely. Every word. "Eleanor." Edmund's voice was gentle but firm. "Do you want me to go back inside and confront them directly? I can do that right now. I have everything I need." I felt the offer land solid and real, this man's steady presence beside me, ready to walk back through those glass doors and dismantle their careful plan in front of 60 witnesses. Part of me wanted to say yes. The part that had been sitting on that step absorbing 8 months of calculated deception wanted very badly to say yes. But I stood up. I pressed my palms flat against my dress, smoothing it. I lifted my chin and breathed in the cool spring air until my chest felt like mine again. "Not yet," I said. "There's something I need to do first." Edmund studied my face for a moment, reading me the way good lawyers read people looking for the thing underneath the words. Whatever he found there, it satisfied him. He gave a single careful nod. I took the documents from his hands, folded them back into the envelope, and walked back toward the glass doors. The music was still playing. Warm amber light spilled through the windows. And through the glass, I could see Savannah laughing at something Zoe had said, her head thrown back. Her whole face lit up with it, completely unaware that the party her parents had built around her birthday was a frame for a trap. That realization that one specifically was the thing that finally made me stop waiting. Carl Whitmore was standing near the fireplace when I found him nursing a glass of bourbon, like he had somewhere better to be, and was trying to decide if it was worth leaving. He was 70 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had worked with their hands before they made their money, with a head of silver hair that Arthur had always teased him about, because Carl had gone gray at 40 and never seemed to mind. He and Arthur had been friends since their 20s, the kind of friendship that outlasts careers and marriages, and the particular cruelties that time inflicts on people who stay close long enough to witness them. He saw me coming before I reached him. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but the particular settling of a man who's been expecting a conversation and is finally ready to have it. "Eleanor." He said my name, the way Arthur used to say it, like it was complete on its own, not leading anywhere, just landing. "Carl." I stopped beside him close enough to keep our voices low. Around us, the party continued its careful performance glasses, catching light conversations running at the smooth surface-level register of professional sociability. Nobody was paying attention to 2 older people standing by a fireplace. He looked at me for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something unavoidable. "I was wondering when you'd find me," he said. "Arthur always said you were the patient one." "He said a lot of things," I replied. "Some of them I'm only now starting to fully understand." Carl turned his bourbon glass slowly in his hand, looking at the amber liquid like it held something he was still working out. "How much do you know?" he asked. "Enough to know there's more," I said. "Tell me about the money, Carl." He exhaled through his nose, a long, slow breath, the kind that carries weight. Then he turned to face the fireplace, and his voice dropped lower still. 2010, he said. Conrad came to Arthur with a real estate investment proposition. Sounded solid on paper, a commercial development outside Richmond, good location, legitimate partners. He asked for $200,000. Carl's jaw tightened. Arthur gave it to him the same week. No contract, no repayment terms, just a father giving his son what he asked for because he wanted to believe in him. I watched the fire. My hands were very still at my sides. 6 months later, the investment had collapsed. Carl continued. Conrad told Arthur the market had turned. Wrong timing, bad luck, nobody's fault. He paused. That wasn't what happened. What happened? I asked, though something in my chest already knew it was going to hurt. Conrad had debts, Carl said flatly. From before the investment, a private venture he'd run 2 years earlier that had gone sideways badly. He owed money to people who weren't willing to wait. A significant portion of what Arthur gave him went straight to settling those debts. The investment was real, but it was also cover. He looked at me sideways. Arthur found out about 4 months after the fact. I was there when he did. My throat ached. I thought about that October evening in Task 4 I had described Arthur coming home, looking hollowed out, pressing his fingers against his eyes, saying it was handled. Now I understood what handling it had cost him. He didn't go after Conrad, I said. It wasn't a question. No, Carl said. He restructured Conrad's role in the business quietly, reduced his access, didn't explain publicly, and he kept going. Carl's voice carried the particular heaviness of someone describing a wound they watched happen and couldn't prevent. That was Arthur. He absorbed things. He thought he could outlast them. And 2015, Carl's expression darkened. Conrad came back. 220,000 different channel a private loan request through a financial intermediary Arthur used. Arthur turned it down. First time he'd ever told Conrad no, outright. A beat. Conrad did not take it graciously. What did he do? Started telling people Arthur had changed, that he wasn't himself anymore. Carl's voice took on a dry, precise edge, that he was being influenced by the woman in his life. My stomach tightened. Even years later, delivered secondhand in a warm room with a fire going, the words still landed with a particular sting, the specific diminishment of being named as a man's weakness rather than his partner. He blamed me, I said. He needed a reason that wasn't himself, Carl said. You were convenient. He turned to look at me fully now, and his eyes were steady and tired and kind all at once. Arthur told me something that winter. We were out on the back porch. It was cold enough that our breath showed, and he said, I'm not angry at Conrad, Carl. I'm just tired of being surprised by him. Carl paused. That was when he started talking to Edmund about the trust, about what it would mean for Savannah. Did he ever tell Conrad directly? I asked. About the money, about the real reason he stopped trusting him. Did he ever just say it? Carl was quiet for a moment. Not the absence of an answer, but the weight of one arriving. No, he said finally. He never did. He thought protecting Conrad from the truth was a kindness. He looked back at the fire. That was Arthur's one mistake. He protected everyone except himself from the truth. The words settled over me like something cold. Arthur, patient, generous, quietly carrying things he should have set down years ago, had gone to his grave, still hoping Conrad might become someone different, still unable to name the thing plainly. I loved him for it, and it had cost all of us. Carl set down his bourbon glass on the mantelpiece. He turned to look at me with the expression of a man who has been holding a secret long enough to feel its weight pressing outward from the inside. The expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided finally that the moment is now. There's something else, he said. His voice was low and careful, the way people speak when what they're about to say cannot be unsaid. About 2019. About the house. He held my gaze. He knew what Conrad did, Eleanor. Arthur knew, and he never told you. He paused. Edmund called me that August. Not to share details, Edmund would never do that, but to ask me to check on Arthur. He said Arthur had received some difficult news about the house, and he was worried about him. I drove out the next morning. Arthur didn't tell me the specifics, but he told me enough. He said Conrad had put them in a position that someone else had to fix, and that he was ashamed he hadn't seen it coming sooner. Carl's words followed me back into the main room like a shadow I couldn't shake. I lifted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood very still near the edge of the room, letting the noise of the party wash over me. The jazz, the laughter, the clink of glasses, all of it continuing its careful performance around me, while my mind went somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere that smelled like hospital antiseptic and August heat, and the particular fear that lives in the space between knowing something is wrong and finding out exactly how wrong it is. The summer of 2019. Arthur had been in the hospital for 6 weeks by then. The diagnosis had come in the spring, aggressive, the doctors said, which was their careful word for fast. We had spent the early summer trying treatments that bought time without buying enough of it. By August, Arthur was spending more days in bed than out of it, and I had learned to read the nurses' expressions, the way you learn a second language in a country you never planned to live in out of pure necessity. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria on a Tuesday morning eating a sandwich I didn't taste when Edmund called. Eleanor. His voice had that particular quality it got when he was managing the delivery of something difficult, measured, careful, the verbal equivalent of handling something fragile. I need to speak with you about the Voss house. There's a situation that requires your attention fairly urgently. I set down the sandwich. Tell me. What Edmund told me in the careful, sequential way he explained things that were complicated and upsetting was this. In 2017, Conrad had approached Arthur with a business proposal. Arthur, who was still well at the time and still trying, always trying to find ways to give his son a foothold, had agreed to co-sign a commercial financing arrangement. The paperwork, Edmund said, had been presented to Arthur as a straightforward business loan. What it actually did, buried in the subordinate clauses of a 40-page document that Arthur had trusted Conrad to explain accurately, was put the Voss house forward as collateral security. The loan was for $480,000. It was due in full in August of 2019. Conrad's company could not pay it. The lender has issued a notice of default, Edmund said. Eleanor, if the debt isn't resolved within 30 days, they will begin foreclosure proceedings on the property. I remember the cafeteria sounds around me, someone dropping a tray somewhere, a child crying 2 tables over, the fluorescent lights humming overhead with that particular institutional persistence. I remember thinking very clearly and very calmly that I was going to handle this. And then I remember my hands starting to shake so badly that I had to press them flat against the tabletop to make them stop. How much to clear it? I asked. Edmund paused. With penalties and the accumulated interest, approximately $340,000. $340,000. The full sum of an investment account I had been building since the end of my first marriage. 21 years of careful, disciplined saving, of choosing the conservative option, of telling myself that financial independence was not optional for a woman who had once had nothing and could not afford to be in that position again. 21 years of a particular kind of quiet determination sitting in a number on a screen. I'll wire it, I said. Eleanor. I'll wire it, Edmund. What do I need to sign? He was quiet for a moment. Then, are you certain this would substantially... I know what it would do, I said. My voice was steady. My hands were still shaking. Arthur is upstairs in a hospital bed. I'm not going to let him lose that house while he's fighting to stay alive. Document everything. I want a full record. I did not tell Arthur. He was dying. He was spending his strength on breathing and on the small, deliberate gestures of a man who knows his time is running short, holding my hand in the evenings, asking about the roses, wanting to know if the carriage house at Whitfield Manor was running well. He did not need to know that his son had put their home in jeopardy. He did not need to spend his last months carrying that alongside everything else. So I carried it instead. I wired the money on a Thursday in late August. Edmund filed the documentation, a formal record of payment, structured as a secured personal loan to the estate, every dollar accounted for, and time-stamped. It was the kind of paperwork that would matter later, even if I didn't know yet exactly how. Arthur died in November. He never knew what had happened. He never knew what I had done. And Conrad, who had caused it, who had signed papers and missed payments and allowed a bank to move toward seizing his father's home, while his father lay dying, Conrad never knew either. I had held that knowledge for 4.5 years. I had held it the way you hold something that is both a wound and a resource, carefully privately aware of its weight, waiting for the moment when setting it down would actually mean something. Now I let the noise of the party come back into focus around me. The jazz, the conversation, the careful performance of an evening built on a foundation of deception. I found Conrad across the room without trying. He was standing near the east windows with Sterling Mack, his real estate broker, his transaction-in-waiting champagne glass raised, laughing at something with the ease of a man who believes the hardest part of his evening is already behind him. His posture was loose. His expression was satisfied. He looked like a man who had done his homework and was confident in the outcome. He was standing in a room that existed because of me, drinking champagne at a party hosted in a building I owned. Holding a piece of paper, he expected me to sign a piece of paper designed to take from me, the last thing Arthur had trusted me, to protect the house I had saved with my own money, while Conrad spent his weekends at their lake house in Wintergreen, entirely unaware that his negligence had nearly destroyed the only home his father had left. He had absolutely no idea. I felt something settle in my chest. Then not anger, exactly, though anger was part of it. Something steadier than anger, something that had been building for 4.5 years and had finally found the shape it needed. I decided, standing there with my sparkling water going flat in my hand, that before the night was over, he would know. All of it. Every last dollar. I was heading back toward the terrace when I heard Gavin's voice, that particular carrying quality. It had the kind that always made me think he wanted to be overheard, even when he was pretending otherwise. Gavin Pruitt had been loud his entire adult life in the way of men who have never been asked to be quiet by anyone whose opinion they respected. He was Conrad's first cousin, 34 years old chronically, between opportunities as he preferred to call it, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from spending years borrowing money from people too polite to say no. I had known him since he first appeared at family gatherings, shortly after Arthur's death, attaching himself to Conrad with the instinctive precision of a man who can identify the nearest source of power in any room and position himself accordingly. Tonight he was standing near the far end of the dining tables, slightly separated from the main cluster of guests with a glass of red wine that was clearly not his first. Sterling Mack stood opposite him, and the body language between them, leaned in voices low but not low enough, was the body language of a private conversation that had no business happening at a birthday party. I stopped behind one of the wide stone columns that divided the dining area from the main hall. The column was thick enough to stand behind without being obvious. I had selected those columns from a salvage yard in 2006 because Arthur wanted the room to feel like it had history. Right now, I was grateful for their width. Gavin's voice drifted over, clearly loosened by wine and the comfortable arrogance of a man who believed himself invisible. "Once she signs tonight, how fast can you close?" he said. "Because I need that money by end of Q2 sterling. That's not negotiable for me." Sterling Mack's response came measured and professional, the tone of a man accustomed to managing impatient clients. "The buyer's ready. Pre-approved at 1.8. Once we have the transfer paperwork fully executed, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks to closing. It's a clean transaction. Conrad promised me 15% off the top for arranging the introduction to the buyer," Gavin said, lowering his voice slightly, not out of discretion, I suspected, but out of habit. "That's the agreement. 15% of 1.8 is $270,000. My debt is $180. The rest I keep." He said it the way people say things they've been calculating so many times the numbers have lost their weight. So yes, end of Q2. That's not a preference, it's a deadline. Gavin made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale of relief, the sound of a man who has been carrying a weight and can finally see the end of it. Good. That's good. He took a long sip of wine. Conrad said she'd sign. She always folds eventually. That's what he says. She just needs enough pressure in the right place. I felt my jaw tighten so hard I heard my back teeth press together. She always folds eventually. I had been described as many things by this family over the years. Inconvenient, irrelevant, a house guest who never left. But there was something about hearing myself reduced to an inevitability, a problem that simply required sufficient pressure to solve, that sent a heat crawling up the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the warmth of the room. I breathed through it, in through the nose, slow and deliberate, the way I had learned to breathe through things over 65 years of being a woman in rooms where men made assumptions about what I would or wouldn't do. $1.8 million. That was the number Sterling Mack had just said out loud at my granddaughter's birthday party. The Voss house. Arthur's house. The house I had saved with every dollar I'd spent 21 years building the house I had promised to protect had been assigned a transaction price. The buyer was pre-approved. The broker was present and ready. The only missing piece was my signature on a document Edmund had already confirmed was a legal trap. And Gavin, who had no ownership stake in any of this, who had never contributed a single thing to the house or the family, or anything beyond the steady consumption of other people's patience and resources, Gavin needed the money by end of Q2. Because Gavin had debts, not small ones. I had heard through the quiet, reliable channels that small counties provide to people who pay attention, that Gavin's debts ran somewhere in the range of $180,000 accumulated across failed ventures, unpaid obligations, and the particular financial wreckage left behind by a man who spends other people's money with more confidence than his own. Conrad had been covering for him for years, quietly in the way older family members cover for younger ones, when the alternative is a scene nobody wants. But Conrad's company was struggling. Conrad needed the house sale, and Gavin needed Conrad to need the house sale. They were all here for money. Every single calculated guest in this carefully curated room had been invited because they served that transaction in some way. Philip Dre appeared from the direction of the bar, moving with the focused efficiency of a man on his way to somewhere specific. He slowed as he passed Gavin and Sterling, and the three of them exchanged the particular glance of people who share information. They don't need to say aloud a fractional nod from Philip, a small tightening of Sterling's expression that might have been satisfaction. Philip moved on without breaking stride. Ke toan, moi gioi, ho hang no nan. 3 pieces of a machine that had been assembled and set in motion months ago, all present tonight under the cover of birthday cake and champagne, and the fiction that any of this had anything to do with Savannah turning 21. I became aware then of someone standing a few feet to my left. Zoe Callahan had apparently stopped near the same column I was behind, not together, just 2 people who had independently found themselves in the same quiet eddy, away from the main current of the party. She was holding a glass of sparkling water, and her face, when I glanced at her, had gone very still in the particular way of a young person processing something that has just confirmed a fear they had been trying to talk themselves out of. Her eyes met mine. They were wide and dark and asking a question she didn't know how to form into words. I gave the smallest possible shake of my head. Not now. Not yet. Trust me. She held my gaze for a moment, searching, uncertain, wanting something to hold on to. Then she gave a tiny tight nod and looked away. I looked across the room toward the birthday table. Savannah was standing at the cake, a beautiful 3-tiered thing with fresh garden roses pressed into the frosting, the kind of cake you order when you want a photograph as much as a celebration. She was laughing at something, her whole face open with it, her dark hair falling across her shoulder as she leaned forward to take the first slice. She looked radiant and young and entirely heartbreakingly unaware. Every person her father had invited tonight was here for one reason, and that reason had nothing to do with her. The door to Whitfield Manor opened at 8 o'clock exactly, and I knew before I turned around who had just walked in. There was only one person Arthur had ever described as arriving like weather. Josephine Voss was 66 years old, Arthur's younger sister by 2 years, a retired school teacher from Harrisonburg, who had spent the last several years keeping a careful and deliberate distance from anything involving Conrad Pruitt. She was tall, the way Arthur had been. Tall with the same steady gray eyes and the same quality of taking up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more. She wore a deep burgundy coat. I didn't recognize her silver hair pinned back simply, and she moved through the room with the particular calm of someone who had decided before she arrived exactly what she had come to do. I had known Josephine for 23 years. She had been at our wedding. She had sat with me through the worst nights of Arthur's illness. She had sent a single card after the funeral, no return address, 3 sentences, every word exactly right. And then she had stepped back from the family the way you step back from a fire that has gotten beyond managing, not because you don't care about what's burning, but because standing closer won't save it and will only cost you. She saw me the moment she cleared the entrance. Her expression didn't change dramatically. Josephine was not a woman of dramatic expressions, but something in her eyes settled the way eyes settle when they find what they came looking for. I crossed the room to her. She pulled me into a hug that was brief and fierce and said more than either of us could have put into words. She smelled like the cedar sachets she kept in her closet and faintly of the cold night air she'd carried in with her. I held on for a moment longer than I usually allowed myself because some embraces are structural. They hold things up that would otherwise fall, and this was one of them. "You came," I said against her shoulder. "Of course I came." Her voice was low, warm, carrying the slight roughness it always had. She pulled back and held me at arm's length, looking at my face the way someone looks at a place they've been worried about from a distance. "Carl called me this afternoon, told me what tonight was really for." Her jaw tightened briefly. I got in the car. She reached into her bag, a large structured leather bag she'd carried for as long as I'd known her, and drew out an envelope. Not cream-colored and heavy like Serena's. This one was old. The paper had gone slightly soft at the edges, the way paper does when it's been handled carefully over a long time. Stored somewhere, it was meant to stay until it was needed. Arthur's handwriting was on the front. His real handwriting, the unguarded version he used for personal things, slightly uneven, entirely his. It was addressed to me. My breath caught. I pressed my fingers against my lips for a moment not to stop myself from crying, though the burning behind my eyes was real enough, but because I needed a second to prepare myself for whatever Arthur had written, when he still had the strength to hold a pen and the clarity to say the things he'd been holding back. "He gave it to me the September before he died," Josephine said quietly. Her voice had gone careful, the careful of someone delivering something precious and breakable. "He said, 'Joe, I need you to hold this for Ellie. Not now, not until she needs it. You'll know when.'" She looked at me steadily. "I think tonight is when." My hands were not entirely steady as I opened it. Arthur's handwriting inside was slower than his usual deliberate, the way writing becomes when it costs something physically. But every word was clear. He wrote, "Ellie, if Josephine has given you this, it means the thing I was afraid of has happened. It means Conrad has decided you are the problem instead of looking honestly at himself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't fix him. I tried for a long time, and I think you know that, even when it didn't look like trying from the outside. I'm not leaving the house to you because I stopped loving him. I need you to know that. I'm leaving it to you because I never stopped loving Savannah, and I know in the part of myself that has always been honest even when the rest of me wasn't ready to be that Conrad will not protect her future if it costs him something he wants. He never has. You will. You always have. That is why I'm asking you to carry this a little longer. Wait for her 21st birthday. Edmund knows what to do. Trust him the way I trusted him, which is completely and without conditions. I loved you. I love you still. Arthur." I read it twice. The second time, my vision blurred at the edges, and I had to press the back of my wrist against my eyes, hard, deliberate to keep myself present in that room, in that moment, standing upright. Josephine put her hand on my arm. "He wrote it himself," she said softly. "Wouldn't let me help him. Said some things had to come out in your own handwriting." I folded the letter back into the envelope. My chest felt cracked open in the best and worst way, simultaneously, the way it feels when you discover that someone understood you completely and you never got to tell them you knew. I became aware through the wet brightness in my eyes that Conrad had seen us. He was standing 40 feet away near the bar, and his champagne glass had stopped moving. He was looking at Josephine and me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, not the smooth social calculation he usually wore like a second skin. Something rawer than any of those things. Something that looked, for just a moment, like the face of a man confronting a thing he had told himself didn't exist. He recognized the envelope. He had never seen its contents, but he knew Arthur had left letters he had stormed out of Edmund's office rather than hear one read aloud. And seeing that old cream envelope in my hands at this party on this night had done something to his certainty that all his planning had not. Josephine noticed him looking. She didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze with the steady, unimpressed patience of a woman who had watched him disappoint his father for 20 years and had long since stopped being surprised by it. Conrad set down his champagne glass. It made a small, sharp sound on the tabletop, the sound of something being put down with more force than intended. Serena appeared at his shoulder immediately, the way she always appeared when she sensed a shift in the situation's architecture. She leaned close and said something into his ear, her lips barely moving. He listened. Then he nodded once slow. Deliberate, the nod of a man receiving an instruction he has already decided to follow. Something changed in the room then, not in the music or the light or the careful performance of the party around us. Something in the pressure, the way the air in a room changes before a storm makes its intentions known. They were going to make their move soon. I could feel it coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. Before I tell you what happened at 8:15 that night, what Serena said, what Brenda did, and the moment that changed every single thing, comment, manner. So I know you're still in this room with me, because you've waited long enough for this part. Quick note. This story includes fictional elements woven in with care and purpose. Names, places, and certain details are coincidental, but the truth underneath every line that is entirely intentional. It happened at 8:15. I know the exact time because I had just checked my watch, a small reflex the kind you develop when you are managing multiple moving pieces and need to know where you are in the sequence. Edmund had texted me 9 minutes earlier, almost ready 10 more minutes. 10 minutes was all I needed. 10 minutes and the evening would unfold the way it was supposed to. Serena didn't give me 10 minutes. I saw her coming from across the room. She had that particular walk she used when she had decided something, shoulders back, chin level, the walk of a woman who has rehearsed what she's about to do and has convinced herself it will go exactly as planned. Behind her, Conrad was already moving to flank her. And at the edge of my vision, I caught Gavin straightening up from the bar, wine glass in hand, repositioning himself the way a supporting actor takes his mark. They had rehearsed this too. Of course they had. Serena stopped 2 feet in front of me. She did not lower her voice. Eleanor. Her tone had shed every pretense of warmth. What remained was the particular coldness of a woman who has decided she no longer needs to maintain an impression. I think we've been patient enough this evening. We'd like an answer on the paperwork before the end of the night. I felt the attention of the nearby tables shift toward us, that almost physical sensation of people redirecting their focus, conversations pausing mid-sentence. I had been in enough rooms to know the sound of an audience assembling. I haven't finished reviewing it, I said. My voice was level. Not cold, not heated, just steady the way a foundation is steady, not dramatic, just there. Serena's jaw tightened. I think you've had sufficient time to... Serena. Conrad stepped up beside her, and when he spoke, his voice was pitched several notches above what the conversation required. Loud enough for the 2 tables nearest to us. Loud enough for the couple standing at the bar who had just gone very still with their drinks. "This isn't a negotiation. That house belonged to my father. You were his wife for 12 years. That doesn't make it yours." The words hit the air and stayed there. I heard from somewhere behind me the sound of a conversation cutting off mid-sentence. I felt the room's temperature change, not literally, but in that social way when everyone in a space simultaneously understands that something real is happening. My hands were perfectly still at my sides. My face was perfectly composed. Inside my chest, something burned with a heat so concentrated it had gone past the stage of feeling like anger and arrived at something cleaner, something that felt almost like relief. Because this was it. This was the thing they had been building toward for 5 years, the dropping of the last pretense. And they had chosen to do it here in this room in front of 60 witnesses on my property. "She's been living off that house for 5 years. Gavin's voice came from behind, and to the left, loud, loose, the voice of a man emboldened by wine and proximity to people he was trying to impress. He pushed forward slightly into the space, his chin lifted, with the particular belligerence of someone who has been waiting for permission to say what he's been thinking. "It's time. It's past time. That house belongs to this family, and everyone in this room knows it." Several heads turned. I saw one of Conrad's business associates, a heavy-set man in a gray suit, whose name I didn't know, look between Gavin and me with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what kind of evening this actually was. From across the room, I caught a flash of pale gold Savannah still near the birthday table, her face turned in our direction. She'd gone very still. The brightness she had been maintaining all evening, the performed happiness, the careful smile had drained out of her face like water from a tipped glass. What was left was something younger and more frightened and entirely real. She understood now what her birthday party had actually been built for. She understood, and the understanding was costing her something visible. Zoe appeared at her elbow, put one hand on her arm, and said something close to her ear. Savannah shook her head once, not at Zoe, but at the room, at the situation, at something she hadn't been ready to see and couldn't unsee now. My throat tightened for her. I wanted to go to her. I would in a matter of minutes, I would, but not yet. Serena turned from me with the decisive motion of a woman escalating to the next phase of a plan. She scanned the room until she found Tessa Birch, the event planner. She had hired a neat woman in her mid-30s with a clipboard and an expression of professional calm that was visibly straining under the current circumstances. "Tessa." Serena's voice carried across the nearby space with deliberate clarity. "Can you please find the venue manager? There's an unauthorized guest situation that needs to be handled by whoever is in charge of this property." Tessa's eyes moved to me, then to Serena, then back to me. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, or perhaps the early stages of comprehension, but her professional training held. She nodded and reached for her earpiece. "Yeah." Gavin's voice again, riding the momentum, drunk on the audience and the wine and the sense that the room was finally watching him matter. He raised his glass in a loose, theatrical gesture. "Someone find the owner of this place and have her removed. There's a guest here who wasn't invited and we'd like her gone." The word "removed" landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. There it was, that word, spoken out loud in front of 60 people on the property I had purchased and built and maintained and saved with my own money. The property where I had hung every chandelier and planted every rose bush and chosen every bolt of fabric on every window. Removed. I breathed in, I breathed out. I was not going to give them anger. Anger was what they expected, what they had planned for what they needed from me to make their version of this story work. I was going to give them something they hadn't prepared for. And then I heard footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, coming from the direction of the kitchen corridor. I didn't need to turn to know. I recognized the footstep pattern the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you've worked alongside for 15 years. Brenda Scholl walked across the room slowly, the way she always moved, with the particular calm of a person who has never needed urgency to be effective. She crossed the space between the kitchen door and where we were standing with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they belong and why. She stopped beside me, not in front of me, not behind me, but beside me, shoulder to shoulder, in the small, deliberate language of solidarity. She looked at Serena, and she said 4 words that changed everything about that night. The music didn't stop. That's the thing about real moments, they don't come with a soundtrack change. The jazz kept playing, a waiter kept moving through the room with a tray of sparkling water, and Brenda said, "Mrs. Pruitt, is there something I can help you with?" Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm, simply the voice of a woman who had managed Whitfield Manor for 15 years and had never once lost her composure in a room full of people. Brenda Scholl was 55 years old and had seen every kind of guest this manor had ever hosted. Nervous brides, grieving families, corporate executives who thought money entitled them to rudeness. She had handled every single one of them without raising her voice. Tonight would be no different, except tonight it wasn't just her job on the line. Tonight it was mine. Serena turned toward Brenda with the particular smile she reserved for people she believed were beneath her, the one that started at the corners of her lips but never quite reached her eyes. She lifted one hand and pointed at me with 2 fingers, the way someone might gesture toward furniture that needed to be rearranged. "Yes," Serena said. "This woman. She was not on the approved guest list for this evening. I don't know how she got in, but I need whoever manages this venue to ask her to leave. This is a private event." I watched Brenda's face. It didn't move, not a flicker. "I see," Brenda said. Then she turned to me, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had been waiting all evening for this exact moment. "Mrs. Voss, would you prefer I ask the Pruitt party to use the East Wing while we sort out the guest list, or would you like to handle this directly?" The room didn't go silent. People nearby were still talking, still holding champagne flutes, still grazing from the hors d'oeuvres trays. But the cluster of people closest to us, Serena, Conrad, Gavin, Tessa Birch, frozen at the edge of the gathering, Sterling Mack half-turned from his conversation with Philip Dre, all of them went perfectly irreversibly still. Serena's smile faltered. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Brenda kept her eyes on me, waiting for my answer. I took a breath. The air tasted like white lilies and warm candlelight, the same scent this room had carried since the spring I planted the garden beds along the East Corridor in 2011. I had planted those flowers myself, kneeling in the Virginia clay, with dirt under my fingernails, and Arthur handing me the bulbs one by one. This room smelled like every choice I had made in this building over 20 years. It smelled like mine. "Handle it directly," I said. Brenda nodded once. Then she turned back to Serena, and her voice when she spoke was still perfectly professionally calm. "Eleanor Voss. She's owned Whitfield Manor since 2004. Is there anything else I can help you with, Mrs. Pruitt?" The sound that came from Serena was not quite a word. It was a compressed, startled thing, the noise of someone whose script had just been pulled out from under them, mid-sentence. Her eyes moved from Brenda to me to Conrad, rapid and uncomprehending, like she was certain she had heard incorrectly and was waiting for someone to confirm the mistake. Conrad's face was something I had never seen before in 12 years of watching that man. I had seen him angry, flushed, jaw tight, controlled. I had seen him dismissive, bored, calculating. But I had never seen him look the way he looked in that moment, stripped. Every layer of confidence, every carefully assembled persona of the powerful son reclaiming what was owed to him gone. What was underneath was something rawer and smaller and much harder to look at. "That's not possible," Conrad said. His voice came out wrong, too high, too thin. "This was my father's property. He transferred the deed to Eleanor in 2008. Edmund Farley stepped forward from the edge of the room. I hadn't seen him move, but there he was, 68 years old, silver-haired, in a dark gray suit that had probably been pressed that morning for exactly this occasion. He held nothing in his hands. He didn't need to. Edmund had spent 40 years as an estate attorney, and he carried his authority the way other men carried briefcases, simply without announcement. Since 2004, Conrad. Your father's name was on the original deed. He transferred it to Eleanor in 2008. It's all in the public record. Every document is filed at the Albemarle County Courthouse. You could have looked it up yourself at any point in the last 16 years. Conrad opened his mouth. Nothing came out. You booked this venue. Edmund continued, not unkindly, but without softening a single syllable. You sent invoices to Brenda's office. You signed a rental agreement. All of that paperwork, which incidentally clearly states the name of the property owner, has Eleanor Voss's name on it. You signed documents confirming you understood who you were renting from. Gavin, who had been standing just behind Conrad's left shoulder, made a sound that was almost a laugh, a reflexive, disbelieving exhale that he cut off the moment he realized the room had turned toward him. His face went a remarkable shade of red. You, Gavin started. Gavin, I said, just his name, nothing else. He stopped. Savannah had gone completely still at the center of the room, her birthday cake half cut behind her, her hand resting against Zoe Callahan's arm. Zoe's fingers had closed around Savannah's wrist, not pulling her anywhere, just holding on. Savannah's eyes were fixed on Conrad. I watched her face move through something I recognized, not surprise, not shock, but the particular quiet of someone watching a truth they had suspected for a long time finally walk into the open and introduce itself. Sterling Mack had set his glass down on the nearest surface and was studying something on his phone with the focused attention of a man who had just decided he was not part of this conversation. Philip Dre had simply taken 3 small steps backward. I looked at Conrad. He was looking at me, really looking at me, maybe for the first time in 12 years, and I could see the precise moment when it landed. Not just that I owned the manor, not just that Arthur had chosen me, but that every person in this room he had spent weeks cultivating every business contact he had gathered here tonight to witness his family's power and his family's property. Every single one of them had just watched him try to have the owner of the building removed from her own house. Conrad, I said quietly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'm not going to ask you to leave. You're my stepson, and this is your daughter's birthday. But I think we should talk, really talk, before this evening is over. Don't you? He didn't answer. The jazz quartet had moved into a new song, something slow and unhurried, the kind of melody that fills a room without demanding anything from it. The candles along the mantelpiece burned at the same steady height they had burned all evening. A waiter moved quietly past us with a fresh tray. The room breathed again, and I stood in the house I had owned for 20 years in the building I had saved with my own money on the grounds Arthur and I had planted together, surrounded by every witness Conrad had invited to see his victory, and I let the moment do what it was always going to do. I let it be enough. There is a moment, and every woman who has ever been called too quiet, too patient, too much, knows this moment. It is the moment when you could smooth everything over, when you could laugh, wave your hand, say, "These things happen." I have smoothed things over for 5 years. I did not smooth this over. Serena moved first. That surprised me. Actually, I had expected Conrad to speak to try to reclaim some authority in the room. But it was Serena who stepped forward, and the smile she produced was the most impressive thing I had seen all evening. It was almost convincing. Almost. There's clearly been a misunderstanding, she said, her voice pitched at the precise frequency of a woman trying to sound gracious while swallowing something very bitter. She glanced around at the nearest guests, that practiced hostess smile, working hard at the corners of her mouth. I looked at her. That was all. I simply looked at her, not with anger, not with triumph. not with the cold satisfaction I might have imagined feeling in this moment if I had ever let myself imagine it. I looked at her, the way you look at something that has finally revealed its full shape after a long time of only showing you pieces of itself. The smile faded. Not all at once, it dissolved slowly like sugar in warm water, until there was nothing left but Serena's face, unguarded, uncertain, and suddenly very aware of how many people were watching. Conrad tried next, Eleanor. His voice had dropped lower, tighter, stripped of the easy authority it had carried at the beginning of the evening. I think we should discuss this privately. We had 22 minutes of privacy earlier this evening, Conrad. I kept my voice level. Not cold, not cruel, simply factual the way you state the time or the weather. You used it to hand me documents that would have transferred my house to your holding company. The intake of breath from the tables around us was not dramatic. It was the quiet collective sound of people recalibrating the subtle adjustment that happens when a room understands that what it is witnessing is not a misunderstanding at all. Gavin made one more attempt. He'd never known when to stop. It was his most consistent quality. That's not what... Sterling Mack placed his hand on Gavin's arm. Not roughly, not with any visible emotion. He simply put his hand there and gave one small, deliberate shake of his head. The gesture of a man who had read the room entirely, understood that every transaction he had come here anticipating tonight was now categorically finished, and had decided that the only intelligent remaining move was stillness. Gavin closed his mouth. I noticed Claire Sutton then. She was standing at the edge of the cluster, slightly apart from Serena, in a way that might have been coincidental and almost certainly was not. Roxanne Holt's crowd had gathered near the far table, but Claire had not moved to join them. She was looking down at her hands, turning a small gold ring on her right finger over and over in a motion that had nothing to do with the ring. I recognized that gesture. It was the gesture of a woman who had known something was coming for a long time and had told herself it was not her place to say so, and was now sitting inside the discomfort of having been right. She never once looked at Serena. I had not expected that to move me. But it did briefly the loneliness of being the friend who knew and stayed quiet and is now standing on the wrong side of the room. Then I felt it. Beside me, close, deliberate, unmistakable. Savannah. She'd crossed the room without a word, without announcement, and she stood at my left shoulder with the calm and the steadiness of someone who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it. She was still holding her small champagne flute, her first legal drink, 21 years old today, and her chin was level and she was not looking at her father. She was simply standing next to me. Of all the things that happened in Whitfield Manor on the evening of April 6th, that was the one that cost me the most to hold on to. Not the ownership, not the documents, not Conrad's face dissolving into something unrecognizable. It was the weight of my granddaughter beside me, the specific quiet gravity of her choosing. I did not let myself cry. I had not come here to cry. Instead, I looked at Conrad and I let him see that I saw him, all of him. The man who had spent 12 years resenting something he never understood, who had built a plan around a house he thought was already his, who had gathered every person in this room to witness a power he did not have and had never had. I hope Savannah has a wonderful birthday, I said. My voice was steady. I meant every word. She looks beautiful tonight. Then I turned to the young woman standing at my shoulder. Shall we sit down, sweetheart? Savannah's fingers found my arm. Yes, she said softly. I'd like that. We walked together to the window table that looked out over the east garden, the rose beds Arthur had planted in 2007, the amber path lights I had installed in 2014, the stone bench where I had sat on a September morning 6 months after his death, and understood for the first time that I was going to be all right. Behind me, I heard Serena say something to Conrad in a very low voice. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because I knew what came next wasn't going to be about the house or the papers or the party. It was going to be about Savannah and what she had just chosen to do. Edmund Farley came to our table at 8:47. He set a slim folder on the table, sat down across from us, folded his hands, and said, "Savannah, happy birthday. I have something for you from your grandfather." Savannah had been holding her champagne flute with both hands the way you hold something when you need an anchor. She set it down carefully. "From Grandpa Arthur," she said. From Arthur Voss, Edmund confirmed with the particular gentleness he reserved for moments that required both precision and care. He prepared this in September of 2019, 2 months before he died. He asked me to hold it until today. Zoe Callahan, sitting just to Savannah's left, reached over and covered Savannah's hand with hers, without a word. Josephine Voss, who had slipped into the chair beside me sometime in the last few minutes, placed both her hands flat on the table and breathed out slowly the long, steadying exhale of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally watching it be set down. Edmund opened the slim folder and turned it toward Savannah. "Your grandfather established an irrevocable trust in September 2019, he said. The asset placed in trust is the Voss House, the primary Voss family estate in Albemarle County, Virginia. The trust was designed to activate on a single condition, your 21st birthday." He paused. "Today." Savannah stared at the document. I watched her eyes move across the page, not quickly, not impatiently, but the way you read something you are trying very hard to understand completely before you allow yourself to feel it. "The trust includes a duress protection clause," Edmund continued. "No sale mortgage transfer or encumbrance of the property can be executed if there is any indication of coercion or undue pressure on the beneficiary. Any such attempt would trigger an automatic legal hold and require court review." He looked at Savannah steadily. "Which means, simply put, that no one can take that house from you, not without your full, free, and uncoerced consent." The candle on our table flickered. Outside the window, the amber path lights traced the edge of the rose garden in the dark. Savannah looked up from the document. She looked at me. "You knew," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You knew this whole time." "Your grandfather asked me to wait until you were ready," I said. "I thought 21 was ready. Why didn't you just tell me?" The words came out faster, now the careful composure beginning to loosen at its edges. "Why didn't you all this time, every family dinner, every Christmas, every time Dad said something about the house, why didn't you just say?" "Because it wasn't mine to say I told her. It was his, and he wanted to say it himself." Edmund reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small laptop, the kind that folds nearly flat, thin, and unassuming. He set it on the table and opened it. The screen lit up with a plain media file, no title, no label, just a timestamp, September 14th, 2019. "He recorded this the same week he signed the trust documents," Edmund said. He slid the laptop toward Savannah. "I'll give you some privacy." He rose from the table and stepped away. Josephine touched my arm briefly, and then she, too, moved her chair back slightly close enough to be present far enough to give Savannah room. Savannah pressed play. The man on the screen was Arthur Voss at 71 years old, sitting in the leather chair by the fireplace in the study at the Voss House. The chair where he had read every evening for 30 years, the chair I had reupholstered in cognac leather the year we married because the original was worn through at the arms. His hair was white, his hands were folded in his lap, and he was looking directly into the camera with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had made his peace with what he had to say. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice was still warm, still entirely, that particular low, unhurried cadence I had heard every morning for 16 years. If you're watching this, it means Eleanor kept her promise. It means you're 21. A small, soft pause. "And it means the house is yours now, Savannah. Not because I didn't love your father, but because I loved you enough to make sure he couldn't take your future away from you." Savannah made a sound, a small compressed sound like something breaking very quietly behind closed doors. Zoe's hand tightened over hers. Arthur continued, "I know this isn't simple. I know it might make things harder for a while. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it from me directly. Eleanor has taken care of everything I could not take care of myself. She has done it without asking for recognition. She has done it without complaint. She kept her word to me, and I am asking you now, I am asking you as your grandfather, not as the man who made your father angry, to know what that is worth." He paused again. When he looked back into the camera, his eyes were wet. "I love you, Savannah. I have loved you since the morning you were born, and I held you in that hospital room, and you grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go. You were always the best of all of us." His voice steadied. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Not anyone." The screen went still. Savannah did not move for a long moment. I did not press her. I sat beside her in the amber light and listened to the jazz quartet play something slow and low from the far end of the room, and I thought about Arthur sitting in that chair in September 2019 and choosing his words carefully because he knew he would not be there to say them himself. Then Savannah turned and looked across the room. Conrad and Serena were standing near the bar watching. Conrad had seen Edmund open the laptop. He had seen Savannah's face. He had seen Josephine lean in. And now, as I watched, he said something to Serena in a low, tight voice, and she nodded once sharply. Then he started walking toward us. Serena followed 2 steps behind, her jaw set and her eyes fixed on the laptop still open on the table. Josephine placed her hand over Savannah's. "He loved you very much, sweetheart," she said softly. "We all did." Savannah looked at me. Something in her eyes had changed, not broken, not hardened, but settled. The way a foundation settles, the way something finally stops shifting. "I know," she said. Behind me, Conrad's footsteps crossed the floor. I had seen many things on Conrad Pruitt's face over 12 years. Anger, contempt, calculation, even occasionally something that might have been grief wearing the wrong mask. But what was on his face now as he closed the distance between us was none of those things. It was desperation. The particular ugly desperation of a man who has just watched the last door close and is still reaching for the handle. Conrad reached our table at 9 o'clock exactly. I know because the clock above the mantelpiece, the one Arthur had brought back from a trip to Edinburgh in 2006, chimed once. A single clear note, like punctuation. He stopped at the edge of the table. His eyes went to the folder first, the slim, cream-colored folder Edmund had left beside Savannah's champagne flute, and then to me. Something moved across his face that I could not immediately name. It was not the anger I had braced for. It was not the contempt I had learned to recognize over 12 years. It was rawer than either of those things and far less controlled. "What did you do?" he said. I looked at him steadily. Outside the window, the rose garden was lit in amber, the same amber I had chosen when I installed those path lights in the autumn of 2014. The same garden where Arthur had spent 3 weekends in the spring of 2007 planting canes in the Virginia clay, coming inside each evening with dirt on his knees and satisfaction on his face. "I kept a promise to your father," I said. "Something you might consider trying sometime." Conrad's jaw tightened. He pulled out the chair across from me, not an invitation, not a question, simply a man accustomed to taking the seat he wanted, and leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his voice dropping to the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but. That house exists because I paid $340,000 in 2019 to stop the bank from taking it. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Because you defaulted on a loan you took out against it without Arthur's knowledge. A loan you arranged in 2017 using his signature on documents he signed for a different purpose entirely. I looked at him. Edmund has the documentation. Every wire transfer, every bank notice, every record of default. It has all been documented since the day I made that payment. The silence that followed was not the silence of people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of people who had just had the floor removed from beneath them. Serena, who had been standing just behind Conrad's left shoulder with her arms folded and her expression set in the rigid composure of a woman prepared to fight, went very still. The color in her face changed. She looked at Conrad, and Conrad looked at me, and for the first time in 12 years, he had absolutely nothing ready. I became aware of Carl Whitmore then. He had moved quietly from wherever he had been standing and was now positioned just behind my right shoulder, not intrusively, not dramatically, simply present in the way that a man of 70 who has known the truth for a long time can be present when the truth is finally being spoken aloud. He did not say a word. He did not need to. His being there was the oldest and most complete form of testimony. Conrad recovered first, or tried to. He straightened slightly, recalibrating, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something I recognized as his last available register negotiation. "Eleanor." He exhaled slowly. "We can work something out." I stood up. Not quickly, not dramatically. I simply rose from my chair the way a woman rises when a conversation has reached its natural conclusion. I was 65 years old. I had been sitting in this chair for over 2 hours. My back ached slightly from the low cushion. These were the ordinary physical facts of the moment, and I was aware of all of them, and none of them made me feel small. "There is nothing to work out, Conrad. The trust is signed. Edmund filed it this afternoon with the Albemarle County Circuit Court. Savannah is 21 years old today." I picked up my small evening bag from beside my chair. "It is done." Serena stepped forward. "You can't just Mom. 1 word. 2 letters." Savannah's voice quiet, clear, and completely without hesitation. Serena stopped as though she had walked into glass. Savannah had risen from her chair beside me. She was standing straight, her shoulders back, her hands still her eyes on her mother's face, with an expression I had never seen on her before, and recognized immediately. It was the expression of a young woman who has just finished becoming herself and is meeting the world from that new height for the first time. "Mom," Savannah said again. "Stop." Serena opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her daughter, really looked at her perhaps for the first time in a long while, and something in her expression shifted, fractured at the edges, into something she would need a great deal of privacy to process. I turned to Conrad. "This was the last time, and I wanted to say it correctly. Your father didn't stop loving you, Conrad." My voice was not angry. It was not contemptuous, not triumphant, not sad. It was simply true the way the date on a document is true, the way a deed filed in a courthouse is true. He just stopped letting your choices hurt the people he loved more. I understand now why that was so hard for you to accept. Conrad looked at me for a long moment. His face was, I will not say broken because that word implies something that was whole to begin with. His face was exhausted. He looked in that moment like a man who had been running towards something for a very long time and had just arrived to find it was never there. He didn't answer. I didn't need him to. I looked at Savannah standing beside the table with Arthur's folder in her hands, her eyes bright and reddened, but dry, her chin level. She looked like the woman Arthur had described in a September video in a leather chair by a fire, in a voice still warm with everything he had left to give. She looked like the person he had always believed she would become. She looked like she was going to be all right. I touched her hand once. Then I walked away from the table through the soft light of the room, past the jazz quartet, still playing something unhurried and low, past the guests who had gone back to their conversations and their champagne and were graciously pretending they had not witnessed every second of the last 15 minutes, past Brenda Scholl, who caught my eye near the kitchen hallway and gave me a single small nod that contained 15 years of loyalty and competence and quiet, steady faith. The side door opened onto the garden path. The April air in Virginia at 9 o'clock in the evening carries the particular coolness of a season still deciding what it wants to be. Not quite the chill of winter, not yet the warmth of summer, balanced somewhere between release and arrival. The rose canes along the east bed were beginning to bud the first small tightened fists of color, just visible in the amber light. I had pruned those beds myself in February, kneeling in the cold with gloves that were not quite warm enough, and taking my time because Arthur had taught me that roses require patience above all other things. I sat down on the stone bench. The Edinburgh clock was faintly audible through the tall windows, its single clean chime already fading into the dark. Arthur used to say, never let anyone know the full size of what you're carrying. I was not speaking to anyone. I was speaking to the garden, to the rose canes, to the amber light, and the April sky shifting slowly from deep blue to the particular shade of violet that only exists in the 20 minutes between evening and full dark. I've carried a lot of quiet for a long time, my love. The night breathed around me. Somewhere inside, I could hear the faint, bright sound of Savannah's laughter, her real laugh unguarded, the one that had not changed since she was 7 years old, and I taught her to make pancakes on a Sunday morning while her parents argued down the hall. I think I'm done now. Behind me, through the tall windows of Whitfield Manor, I could see the party continuing. The music was still playing. Savannah was still standing, and for the first time in 5 years, the weight I had been carrying felt like it had finally found the right pair of hands. I sat in that garden for a long time after everyone had gone inside. People ask me sometimes whether I regret the quiet years, the 5 years of letting things go, of smoothing things over, of choosing peace over truth. And my honest answer is yes and no. I regret what the silence cost me. I do not regret what it taught me. Here is what I know now at 65, sitting on a stone bench in a garden, my late husband planted with his own hands. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives slowly dressed in small dismissals and convenient excuses until one day you look up and realize you've been disappearing for years and no one in the room noticed because you made it so easy for them. And family revenge, the kind the world wants to see loud and burning, was never what I was after. What I wanted was simpler than that. I wanted Savannah to have what Arthur meant for her to have. Everything else was just the path to get there. If I could say one thing to you directly, don't wait as long as I did. Don't confuse patience with permission. God gave you a voice for a reason. Use it before 5 years become 10. I am not a perfect woman. I made choices I'd revisit if I could, but I kept my promise, and some nights that is enough. If any part of this story sat with you, if you recognized someone in these pages or found something you needed to hear, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you're there when the next story begins. The best conversations always happen in the comments. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. A note before we continue: some of the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted with care and purpose to illuminate, not to harm. If that's not what you're looking for today, no hard feelings. There's something out there for everyone. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.